It's October 28th, 1893 at 8 p.m. in St. Petersburg, Russia. Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky walks up to the podium with vigor and he bows to the audience, then conducts the premiere of his Symphony No. 6. Before that day, Rimsky-Korsakov asked Tchaikovsky if it told the story. Tchaikovsky said yes, but never divulged what it was. What the audience was unaware of was that Tchaikovsky was embroiled in a web so entangled and so mysterious, there was no escape. This evening was the last that the public would see of him. And that symphony, it did tell a story. We can only guess at what evidence discovered in the music means. Biographers and musicologists have presented a variety of views. We'll see. But before we begin the story of the web and the mystery of his death, let me tell you how I got involved in all of this. A while back, I inherited a stack of piano music from an old man. I flipped through the yellowed pages. I looked for something interesting to play, and I got fascinated by one sonata that was curiously annotated with scrolling notes. There was a haunting feeling that something was different. These weren't ordinary teachers' comments. My teachers made check marks, one-word comments, faster, slower, practice here, good, no good. This was different. This was a love letter, encrypted in scattering of loosely connected, impassioned phrases. Except for crumbling pages, I had no perspective of the period of these writings, nor the motivations of the music teacher. The enigmatic warmth of the annotations led to images of a covert relationship and a possible drama, perhaps a secret gay student-teacher connection that mustn't have been discovered. Something was going on here. Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky was in just that predicament. He was idolized and cherished by his Russia. 19th century Russia competed with France and Germany as a center of culture. Russia desperately needed to parade world-known and loved Tchaikovsky as their flawless signature icon to promote commerce, as well as their culture and reputation. Tchaikovsky was flaunted as unblemished, otherwise it would have threatened the beloved Russia and the Tsar. But Tchaikovsky was gay in a country that tortured, exiled, and executed homosexuals. I looked at the cryptic markings in this music and imagined Tchaikovsky communicating to a lover. A plan, in some cryptic way eluding the Tsar's spies and the powerful Russian Orthodox Church. There is still widespread denial in Russia that Tchaikovsky was gay. I assume the writings that did survive were sought after by zealots of the fatherland and were a deadly danger to those who possessed them. The last year of Tchaikovsky's life, culminating in his unusual constructed final symphony, the Pathétique, is shrouded in mystery. The accounts of Tchaikovsky's death are steeped in secrecy and rumors, as if published in some 19th century tabloid. I was inspired to write a story. I read loads of his letters and those from relatives and patrons. I researched, I traveled to Russia and spoke with some locals. I learned some amazing things that I'll share with you today. The novel I wrote is titled Coda, there it is, my interpretation of those final years. And as many of you know, the coda is a pathway to the end, an escape, if you will. The notation is a crosshairs. We'll have to check out the edges before landing on those crosshairs. Here's where it starts. When Tchaikovsky was born in the spring of 1840, the Tsar was Nicholas I. He was tyrannical, warring, feared, terrifying. A biographer, Razanovsky, wrote, and I quote, Nicholas I came to represent autocracy personified, infinitely majestic, determined and powerful, hard as stone and relentless as fate. If one was gay, he was shipped to a work death camp in Siberia. And by the way, Tsar Nicholas I also hardened the serf contracts. A footnote, serfdom. That's a kind of voluntary slavery. You sign a contract, the Tsar's militia will protect you against marauding bandits for a percentage of your production. These contracts were for life and generally included your family and heirs. If you preferred to go it alone without the contract, the Tsar's militia magically turned into the very thieves and bandits advertised to protect. Nick wasn't a nice guy. This was one of the Tsars. This was the Tsar of Tchaikovsky's childhood. Tsar Nicholas I reigned until Tchaikovsky was 15. So Tchaikovsky came of age during the reign of this frighteningly tough Tsar who pressed the laws condemning and harshly punishing homosexuality as Tchaikovsky was becoming aware that he was gay. But Tchaikovsky did have a happy childhood. Even though he was not in a particularly musical family, they started his piano lessons at age 5. There he is at the far left by his beloved mother. At that time, it was unlikely one could manage a living from music. So, in 1850, Tchaikovsky was sent to the Imperial School of Jurisprudence in St. Petersburg. Tchaikovsky was 10 years old. The entry age was 12, but his father had him slipped in. He graduated in 1859 at 19 years old. Although he took a different career path, this school plays an important role. Keep this place in mind. We'll be coming back to this association at the end. He wrote secret letters to his brother, his confidant, Modeste. Yes, his younger brother was also gay. He called him Modia. He speaks of his friends, quote unquote. They start appearing in these letters to his brother. One name is different. Sergei Kiriev in the School of Jurisprudence. First, in a guarded way, then Sergei is mentioned as a friend, then as a lover. According to Tchaikovsky's brother, Modeste, it was, quote, the purest love of his life. And so, while in this stiff, formal, all-boys boarding school, Tchaikovsky begins to pursue a search for love in his way. While Tchaikovsky is in school, Tsar Nicholas I died of pneumonia in 1855. Tchaikovsky was 15 at that point. Next in line was Tsar Alexander II. He reigned until Tchaikovsky was 41. This was a blessing, far more liberal than his predecessors. Alexander II freed the serfs and ended that feudal system. That was a big deal. For Tchaikovsky, this liberal environment was a godsend. He matured and developed his persona in a safe environment. Morality crimes were still punishable by death, but were rarely enforced. Tchaikovsky made friends and lovers in a relatively unthreatening environment. His graduation from the School of Jurisprudence. He landed a lowly job with the Ministry of Justice. That's him at graduation. That year, Tsar Alexander's aunt founded the Russian Musical Society to foster native talent. Tchaikovsky entered, and when the St. Petersburg Conservatory opened in 1864, Tchaikovsky rushed to enroll. He graduated 4 years later and was appointed professor at this new conservatory in Moscow. Here begins his music profession. But when Tchaikovsky was 41, everything changed. Beloved Tsar Alexander II, during a military parade in St. Petersburg, some woman walks up to the Tsar's carriage carrying a gift in white cloth. She makes some ceremonial gestures and bows, and then at the last second, she slips it under the carriage in front of lots of bystanders. A bomb goes off immediately under the carriage, killing the Tsar. This was the world's first suicide bombing. And into Tchaikovsky's life enters the reign of Tsar Alexander III. Nothing like his liberal predecessor. Tyrannical is the word used to describe him. Narcissistic. He is a textbook case of narcissism, grandiosity, and a total lack of empathy, concerned with self-image over anything else, and a constant fear that his power is challenged. He loved Tchaikovsky as a national treasure, not necessarily as a person. He commissioned, I should say rather, he commanded Tchaikovsky to write his Coronation March. Alexander III had a coronation that was spectacular. It put all previous to shame, and it underscored his grandeur. A spectacle coronation is just the ticket. This is Hollywood. The orchestra isn't shown in this painting, but it's there. Here's what it sounded like as Alexander III marched onto the stage, and I hope you can hear this. And the music goes on, quite grand. I've looked at this painting carefully, and clearly each face is distinctly different, and surely a real attendee. Alexander III restored the harsh sentences of everything, including gay. Gay, it was scandalous. A death sentence, off to the Siberian death camps. Interestingly, Alexander III knew of gay. Tsar Alexander III had a gay brother. Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich was gay. It was believed that it was well hidden. It was not. He was described as flamboyant, brilliant green eyes, and exhibition posture. He paraded like a peacock, some said. The Grand Duke was particularly deferential to the church. This is important. After all, the church was his worst enemy. By the way, the Grand Duke was assassinated at the age of 47 by a terrorist bomb at the Kremlin during the 1905 Russian Revolution. Much of what we know is through the steady flow of letters between Tchaikovsky and his brother Modest Modia. his confidant. I've mentioned that Tchaikovsky's younger brother was also gay, and he was not particularly secret about it. Modia saved these letters, watching his brother become world famous, anticipating their future value. Much of what we know today is from those letters. Tchaikovsky had many short-term lovers. Here's a sampling of them. Alexei Aputkin is the same age as Tchaikovsky. They met in school. Tchaikovsky wrote 5 songs to his poems. Alexei became morbidly fat, and that was the end of that. In 1876, when Tchaikovsky was 36, he became attached to Joseph Kotek, a 20-year-old violinist. Tchaikovsky called him Kotik. In Russian, Kotik means pussycat. Kotik. Kotek was best man at Tchaikovsky's quickie wedding, a brief, unfortunate marriage of convenience. There's no time to get into that here now. There were only a couple of people at the wedding anyway. And there was Alexei Sofronov, Alosha, his valet, 19 years younger. Vladimir Shalovsky, a wealthy young man, 12 years younger. He died right after Tchaikovsky's funeral, by the way. There were many others, but Tchaikovsky had a strange dedicated to his nephew, Vladimir Davidov, strangely called Bob, the son of his sister. Tchaikovsky was infatuated, revered him, obsessed by Bob, who, by the way, was also gay. In one of his letters, he writes, "The unmentionable love for Bob." Tchaikovsky left his estate to Bob. More importantly, he dedicated his 6th symphony, the Pathétique, to Bob, a significant gesture. There was extraordinarily love between the two. But as far as known, they never fooled around. After Tchaikovsky's death, Bob grieved, lamented, and in 1906 shoots himself. But it was Edward Zach that had one of the most striking effects on Tchaikovsky. Of all the sensual relationship Tchaikovsky had, this was the most passionate and heartfelt. Tchaikovsky's relationship with Edward Zach cultivated a major transition in Tchaikovsky's creativity and in the depth of his persona embedded in his music. Zach was a young man, a boy actually working a menial job for the railways in the Ukraine. His boss was Tchaikovsky's elder brother, Nikolai. Letters back and forth between the Tchaikovskys described this handsome young guy, tall, slender, brilliant eyes like glowing emeralds, blonde hair, and a wonderful smile. Tchaikovsky ended one letter to Nikolai, and I quote, "For God's sakes, do arrange this." Edward Zach came to St. Petersburg and enrolled in Tchaikovsky's composition class in the conservatory when he was 15 years old. Tchaikovsky was immediately taken to Zach. One of Tchaikovsky's letters had the phrase, "It seems to me that I have never loved anyone as much as him." They became lovers in the spring of 1869. I remember reading that at first they were cautious when they went out to concerts to avoid talk. Tchaikovsky behind Edward so Tchaikovsky could rest his hands on the young man's shoulders. That arrangement soon ended. His letters Modest used the phrase in more than one place, "Lyubov и pochat," love and lust. In the autumn of that year, 1869, the passionate tone poem Romeo and Juliet was published, created during that summer. The story was discussed with his colleagues and his brother Modia. As many of you know, it's about conflict. The Montagues versus the Capulets, the Sharks versus the Jets, gay love and social mores, love, rejection, society, forces in constant conflict. in this case, leading in the end to the tragic death of the two lovers. According to biographers, there is no doubt that he wrote the overture with extraordinary enthusiasm and inspiration, with love for Edward Zach. Here, for the first time, he voiced emotional themes that lift all his subsequent works: the drama of unfulfilled and frustrated love, and of impossible youthful passion consumed by omnipresent death. In the case of Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet, an intimate link can be seen between this fervent piece of music and a secret drama unfolding in Peter's life at the time of its composition. It's a violent, passionate piece. Here's a sampling of the violent statement. That is violent. And the violence gives way to a dreamy theme, one of the most luscious melodies in all his works. But the conflicting love-violence portended things to come. 4 years later, in 1873, Edward Zach committed suicide. He shoots himself in the head. It's getting to be a common theme. Tchaikovsky never gets over it. 14 years later, in his diary, there are two torturous diary entries. Keep in mind that this is 14 years after Edward's death, a span of years that in its very length testifies to the intensity of Tchaikovsky's feeling. On September 4th, 1887, he wrote, and I quote, "Before going to sleep, thought much and long of Edward, wept much. Can it be that he is truly no more? I cannot believe it." On the following day, he made another entry, even more significant, and I quote, "Again, thought of and recalled Zach. How amazingly clearly I remember him. The extraordinarily wonderful expression on his face at times. I cannot conceive that he should now be no more. His death, that is, complete non-existence, is beyond my comprehension. It seems to me that I have never loved anyone so strongly as him. My God, no matter what they told me then and how I try to console myself, my guilt before him is terrible. And at the same time, I loved him. That is, not loved, but love him still. And his memory is sacred to me." End quote. Romeo and Juliet ends with a heartbeat. Listen. At this point, we have to go back to Alexander III. His populism at that time was growing, and the Tsar's power was waning. His extreme views were becoming less and less tolerated. He becomes more savage, barbaric, tyrannical than his grandfather, really Stalinesque, cruel, brutal, terrifyingly ruthless. His solution to his thoughts of diminishing power and tarnishing image: generate and feed fear. Divert attention from disease, starvation, cultivate anger, hate. Blame the Jews. Expel them from the city. He had the Cossacks mow down the Jewish villages. Things were still not going well. There were rumblings of revolution, so he turned to the Russian Orthodox Church for power. The price for that were ghastly moral rules, harsh penalties for gays, If one was accused of being gay, or one knew of someone that was gay and didn't accuse them, off to Siberia with no return. Again, we come back to clinical narcissism, grandiosity, a lack of empathy, and in this case, now, the fear of diminished grandeur and image. Tsar Alexander III felt his world, reputation, and power was vanishing. And he kept an eye on his asset, Tchaikovsky. In the 1880s, Alexander III competed with Paris culture. It was a matter of commerce, Russian national pride, extreme nationalism. French politics was in turmoil, perhaps an opportunity for the Tsar. But in France, it was la belle époque, the beautiful era, while Moscow was still in a backwater. In 1889, the Paris Exposition opened, celebrating the centennial of the French Revolution. Tchaikovsky was 49. The Eiffel Tower went up, opened May 1st, 1889. It was the tallest structure in the world until the Chrysler Building in New York City. The Paris Centennial was no ordinary fair. It was huge. A World's Fair with elaborate pavilions, fantasy fountains, and exotic landscaping design, paying homage to Versailles. It featured culture, technology, nature from all over the world, except Russia. All attention went to Paris. Alexander III became more discouraged. His place in the world was an insignificant footnote, as he saw it. And time went on. 2 years later, Alexander III's outlook on the world changed. Russia, Moscow, the Tsar, had the most famous musician in the world, known in every corner of the globe. And New York wanted him. He received a telegram from Andrew Carnegie in New York City. On May 5th, 1891, Carnegie Hall, the biggest music hall in the world, was to have its grand opening. This was a world event. For the dedication performance, Andrew Carnegie insisted on opening with Tchaikovsky. What could be grander? Tchaikovsky was offered $5,000 for the appearance. That's about $140,000 today, a full year's premium salary. Communication was sent to Tchaikovsky and the Tsar. Tsar Alexander III was thrilled, electrified, peed in his pants with joy, I would guess. Tchaikovsky, their rock star, at the Grand Concert Hall in the grand city of New York. Sending Tchaikovsky to New York City was perfect. It would be a shot across the bow to Paris. There were conditions. To open Carnegie Hall, Tchaikovsky must conduct the Tsar's coronation march. And there were serious concerns. Tchaikovsky was 50, handsome and spirited. Tchaikovsky was a world celebrity, going to New York City to open Grand Carnegie Hall, but he was gay. It was known in closed circles, but not known to the public. If Tchaikovsky was found out to be gay in New York City, it would ruin the Tsar and end the culture war. Alexander feared humiliation. And we know that narcissism and humiliation don't go together. Tchaikovsky was known to solicit male prostitutes. He was attracted to young lower classes. What could go wrong? What if Tchaikovsky wandered to the West Side loading docks? What could go wrong? Indeed, Tchaikovsky III arranged an entourage that accompanied Tchaikovsky as much as possible. However, while in New York City, letters to Modeste about Greeks and friends of Greeks. Today, one might say friends of Dorothy. In other words, he reported back his sexual conquests in clandestine code. Tchaikovsky was observed by the Tsar squans nearly everywhere. The trip was successful. Tchaikovsky, more than ever, a priceless royal asset. He wrote back about the friendliness of New Yorkers, the handshaking, the warm hugs, the smiles in public, not done in Moscow. He was overwhelmed by New York City culture and loved every minute of it. This photo was taken the afternoon of opening night. The press flocked to get a glimpse of celebrities. Tchaikovsky. Note, I don't see any women in the crowd. And Carnegie Hall, the grandest concert in the hall in the world, opens with Tchaikovsky conducting Tsar Alexander's III Coronation March. And this is Carnegie Hall. This was Tchaikovsky's view when he turned to bow. Really grand. The audience went wild. What could be more reassuring? New York City was still ringing the next day. On the front page of the World newspaper, 2 cents got you a report of the stunning event. I read on that page, really with some difficulty, that Tchaikovsky was, quote, a charming man, and the performance, wonderful precision and effect. Of course. It was such a delightful experience. Tchaikovsky had this photo made and thanked Walter Damrosch, the director of Carnegie Hall, and that event. Curiously dated May 26, 1892, more than a year later. Things moved slowly in those days. But it impresses how significant the trip was to Tchaikovsky and, of course, to the Tsar. And now the web tightens. Here's where things darken and get sticky. While Tchaikovsky is the heart and soul of Russia, the icon of the Tsar, and so well known, he has an affair with a young officer, Alexander Vladimirovich Stenbuk-Ferma. He was a corps de page, officer of the regiment of the Hussars, Capitaine de Cavalerie. This ain't some dock worker who is invisible to all but a few. This is well-known royalty. And this good-looking guy is the nephew of a count. Not just any count, but Count Alexei Alexandrovich Stenbuk-Ferma, a close friend of the Tsar. And his uncle is pissed. He's infuriated. His nephew gay and hanging out with high visibility celebrity? Careers could easily swirl into a sewer. That is his career. In a fit of anger, the Count writes a revealing, damning letter to the Tsar. And he gives the letter to a courier, a friend of his. By the way, 2 years later, Oscar Wilde was in the exact same situation. By an amazing coincidence, the courier is Nikolai Jacobi, who turns out to be a classmate of Tchaikovsky's at the School of Jurisprudence. Remember the School of Jurisprudence? Jacobi discovered what the letter was about. I would guess he fooled around with the seal. It was about dishonoring the Count, the Tsar, and Russia. But Jacobi was most concerned about dishonoring his alma mater and ultimately himself. Jacobi feared the threat of scandal, voices in the shadow, his alma mater. However, since it was an official complaint, it couldn't be ignored. Nikolai Jacobi decided to convene a court, a kangaroo court, if you will. The court would be made up of himself and any other classmates of the School of Law, the College of Law, who could be rounded up on short notice. The court was finally composed of 8 men. On October 31st, they met at Jacobi's office in his home. Tchaikovsky was asked to attend this court of honor. Asked, hardly. The members of the court announced to Tchaikovsky that the only way they would withhold the letter from the Tsar was if he committed suicide. Otherwise, the letter was delivered and the dreaded consequences are well known. Keep in mind what Tsar that we're dealing with here. How do we know all of this? Jacobi's wife sat in an anteroom and moved her rocking chair closer to the closed door, innocently knitting and listening, eavesdropping, and later writing notes. She noted that Tchaikovsky came running out of the court, crying. I assume that she's a reliable source. What followed suggests that she was. There was a cholera pandemic through most of Europe at that time. It was decided to make it look like cholera. Even though this was a disease of the poor, and Tchaikovsky at this point was wealthy, certainly not a logical candidate for cholera. They decided on arsenic poisoning. It has similar symptoms to cholera, vomiting and diarrhea, although it's much faster. Who would notice the difference? On November 2nd, Tchaikovsky started taking small doses of arsenic. Tchaikovsky became ill on the morning of November 6th. He refused to permit a doctor to examine him until that evening, when he must have known the poison had taken effect. Keep in mind that this was just a few days after he premiered his masterwork, Symphony No. 6. The cover-up began the moment he was pronounced dead. Rumors began to circulate almost immediately that Tchaikovsky had committed suicide. To counteract them, New Times, a St. Petersburg newspaper, published an article on November 7th, the day following his death, titled The Illness and Death of Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Its author was Lev Bernardovich Bertenson, the composer's physician. Dr. Bertenson described in detail how Tchaikovsky's illness progressed with all the symptoms of cholera. This was the definitive account. He documented a moment-by-moment account of the symptoms, yet it was a lie. Actually, you can read the moment-to-moment account in this book. I'll come to this later. The death of Tchaikovsky really remains a mystery to this day. There is an official story as told by Peter's brother, Modest, in his, quote, definitive biography, which appeared 3 years after Tchaikovsky's death in 1893. It is called, quote, The Fatal Glass of Water. In this narrative, the composer died after drinking a glass of unboiled water in Modest's apartment during the cholera epidemic, then raging in St. Petersburg. Another variant is told by a friend who attests to being present at Leaner's, an upscale restaurant, when Tchaikovsky ordered cold water, even if unboiled, was refused, pulled rank, and glugged down a glass, saying something like, who cares? Stories abound. Is everything I've told you true? Maybe not. There was a lot at stake, and perception was everything. It appears that Tchaikovsky had a premonition of the pending circumstances. During this period, while being somewhat before the court meeting, Tchaikovsky sent a letter to Modest, and I quote, now on my journey, the idea of a new symphony came to me, this time one with a program, but a program that will be a riddle for everyone. Let them try and solve it. The work will be entitled A Program Symphony. Continuing the quote, the program of this symphony is completely saturated with myself, and quite often during my journey, I cried profusely. Having returned, I have settled down to write the sketches, and the work is going so intensely, so fast, that the first movement was ready in less than 4 days. And then Modest actually suggested the title, the Pathétique. Indeed, this masterwork symphony is loaded with enigmatic and unusual artifacts. For instance, in the first movement, unrelated to music before or after, the trombones quote from the Russian Orthodox Mass for the Dead. One might not be suspicious of that if that was not all. It's the fourth, final movement that is the most mysterious. I have to digress for one moment and talk about his opera, Eugene Onegin. Friends and colleagues often suggested books or plays as the basis for opera. Pushkin's poetic novel, Eugene Onegin, came up several times. Tchaikovsky was at first intimidated by the literary perfection of the Pushkin novel, so they say. But he got very involved in the characters and the philosophies of the story. The Pushkin story dances around the concept of discontent, desolation, and death. There are three main characters: Eugene Onegin, an arrogant, wealthy traveler, a dandy, if you will; Vladimir Lenski, a poet, and eventually a friend of Onegin; and Tatiana, a shy, quiet sister of Lenski's fiancée. The story is simple. Onegin is pursued by Tatiana. He rejects her. Later on, Onegin returns from travels and he pursues Tatiana, and she now rejects him. There are some words for Tatiana's honor. Lenski challenges Onegin to a duel. Onegin is a known sharpshooter. Lenski is a poet, knows nothing about firing a pistol. He knows he will lose. In the scene of the duel, in the dusk of dawn, Lenski sings a farewell to life aria. In the Pushkin story, the killing of Lenski is the death of innocence and sincerity. In the opera, the melodic line is the signature of impending death. The text is, "Where have you gone, O golden days of my spring? What does the day coming have in store for me?" Listen carefully to this melody. Now back to the opening of the final movement of Tchaikovsky's final work, performed days before his death. That's it. Exactly. It opens with Lenski's painful cry of despair, a sobbing character marked lamenting, lamentoso. This is precisely the melody of impending death. And the unsettled, sobbing character is in no small part because nobody is actually playing it. Let me say that again. Nobody is actually playing it. Look at the score. It's not there. That is what you just heard. No one has Lenski's cry of despair, farewell to life. Rather, the first and second violins both play figures consisting of upward, downward leaps, and the theme emerges from whichever part has the highest note. That construction tends to make the melody played not smooth, hence the sobbing character. And the theme stands behind a mask. Autobiographical, Tchaikovsky made it clear that this symphony was autobiographical. He told his friends in no uncertain terms that there was a personal story behind and within the music. Rimsky-Korsakov, if you remember, begged for the story, and Tchaikovsky said, I quote, "You figure it out." The French title, Pathétique, has a connotation of the forbidden grand passion pathétique of French opera. And the ending of Tchaikovsky's last movement of his last work is not bombastic, bustling bravado, swagger like nearly every symphony before this, but lamenting. It ends with low, tolling pizzicato heartbeats in the double basses that finally expire into silence. It's too soft for me to play here, but you can see it in the score. Let's return to October 28th, 1893. Tchaikovsky premieres his final work, knowing that he will soon begin the process that will end his life to avoid the shame and possible torture of being gay in 19th century Russia. Let's go over the timeline. Saturday night, here we are. He's conducting his Symphony No. 6. Thursday, he starts small amounts at first of arsenic. On Monday, his death is announced. 4 days later, it looks like unusually rapid cholera. Doctors are called to witness, but it's not that. The coffin is soldered shut to contain the cholera. Some say it was not soldered shut. There's loads of misinformation. Rimsky-Korsakov stated this diagnosis looks suspicious. The official word, it was an accident. There were false witnesses emerging from everywhere, swearing that they saw him drink unboiled water. Tchaikovsky's funeral took place on Thursday, the 9th of November in 1893, in St. Petersburg at the Kazan Cathedral. It holds 6,000 people, but more than 60,000 applied for tickets. Finally, they squeezed in 8,000 people. Tsar Alexander III paid for the funeral out of personal funds. That was very unusual. Tchaikovsky was so highly regarded. Books were written about the physician's account. Again, this book by Poznanski. Official word, cholera, all propagandized. The Tsar's greatest cultural research, his rock star, his Elton John, if he had gotten that letter, would he have put Tchaikovsky in a Siberian gulag, publicly humiliated him to the world, ended his career? Probably not. So in his last days, Tchaikovsky went from his home in Klin, a country house where he did his final compositions, to St. Petersburg, to the home of Modest Tchaikovsky and Bob Davidov on the corner of Mayala Morskaya and Gorakhovaya streets in St. Petersburg. It was here, at the top of floor apartment, that Tchaikovsky went through the agony of arsenic poisoning to appease the dark laws of Tsarist Russia. So we've come full circle to the strange end of someone who's given so much to us. Tchaikovsky's and his contemporaries slavishly bowed to social mores that they surely knew were wrong. I mentioned a book I wrote based on what I had learned, a novel, my interpretation. In my story, I called Edward Zach Ivan. Here is one short paragraph from that book. In this scene, Peter Tchaikovsky's landlady accidentally discovers Peter and Ivan embracing. And I read. Peter looked at Ivan's terrified face and for a brief moment felt the gravity of the encounter. But his soberness vanished quickly, and a stifled chuckle cascaded into a giggle and broke into a drunken laugh. Ivan's face glowed, and his rosy cheeks nearly eclipsed his sapphire eyes. This was a happy time, to be coveted, but their carelessness would have a price. Ivan asked in a cautious voice, "Is this how it will be, evading every suspecting eye? Will people ever see past the crushing influences of Russian inhumanity?" Peter walked to the other side of the room with his head down, and after a short time turned to Ivan. In one edition of the Beethoven piano sonatas, there's a misprint. A C sharp is printed as a C natural. The printing is so blatantly wrong that any sane pianist would make the correction with little thought. If the correction is not made, the sound is a terrible assault on the ears and the intellect. Nevertheless, one occasionally hears that sonata performed with that wrong note. The pianist would rather have his ears abused with what he must know is wrong than oppose the presumed authority of Ludwig van Beethoven, the grand master. The offensive error is repeated in concert again and again by trusting musicians with the fear that disobeying Master Beethoven is beyond their domain of influence. Authority, whether real or perceived, is hard for some to challenge, no matter how it affronts them. This is the Orthodox Church. Thank you. I hope that you now appreciate Tchaikovsky's music, not merely masterful constructions of extraordinary music content, but an intimate connection to his soul and his life in unusually difficult circumstances.